Which brings us to our speaker today, is going to be Kate Carter. She's from the prestigious National Center for Science Education, and she's the Director of Science Education. She has a Ph.D. in human evolutionary biology from a small school up on the northeast side of the country. You may have heard of it. Harvard. I think she spent something like 7 years there. So she's now active in doing what she enjoys doing. She's had 15 years experience in informal science education. She likes to hike, so if anybody wants to hike, she's going to be doing that on Monday. She's staying an extra day because she wanted to get up into our mountains. So that's what she's going to do. So the title of the talk, of course, as you probably know, is Why is Trust in Science Failing? And the media that is doing this, the social media apparently is the cause of it, because I think they give equal weight almost to science is science to them. Bad science, good science. What's the difference? And it was curious. We were eating out last night, and I have a waitress that I've known there, and we said, "Oh yeah, who is this other person with you?" And I said, "Who was she was going to do?" And he said, "They've lost interest in science, and they just don't care." She said, "Social media," and that woman knew right away. It was just incredible. We thought, "Wow, that's incredible that she has figured that out." But of course, this waitress has a master's degree too, so she knows how to think a little bit. So, but it is hard for some people to judge the difference between the two. They just think, okay, here's some information and here's some information. So they lack the critical thinking skills that we know are so important. She will share the results of the teaching strategy and explains the motivation that drives this science cynicism. So Kate, give her a big hand. Kate Carter.
Good morning, everyone. All right, I'm gonna All right, now there's no feedback. All right, thank you so much for having me. My name is Kate. I am from the National Center for Science Education, as Jerry mentioned. Many of you probably are familiar with our organization from the Fight for Science Standards in Arizona that happened this fall. With the support of members like you, we were able to keep Arizona from adopting standards that would not educate people with evidence-based evolution and climate change science. So that's a big success, and I don't know how many of you were involved, but it's something that we're really excited about. But so that's the kind of reactive work that NCSE does. But I actually work with the proactive work, where we're trying to bring evidence-based science to people that may have never experienced it. But there's evidence, and then there's evidence. And a lot of unscrupulous actors are working to make sure that we don't understand how one evidence differs from the other. So I figured since it's St. Patrick's Day, we'd start with a little bit of fun. How many of you know about bad ad hoc hypotheses? So the classic bad ad hoc hypothesis is that babies have oval heads, kind of football-shaped heads, and have a lot of fat because they're kind of obnoxious. They need to be punted away so their genes can be spread. But since they have a lot of fat, they can be punted away and they won't hurt when they land. So I'm going to share one of my ad hoc hypotheses. I promise I'm going somewhere more intellectual with this. We'll start with some fun, though. So my Ph.D. is in evolutionary biology. I worked with humans. So this is a Neanderthal. And when most people think about Neanderthals, they have a very specific definition of what a Neanderthal is. Some brutish guy, like at a barbecue with his beer belly hanging out. Yeah, I know, it's all good. But actually, Neanderthals, they had larger brains on average than humans. They have larger bodies, and they use complex tools, and they even had things like jewelry. So a lot of times, we're really unsure where behavioral reconstructions from Neanderthals came about. And one of the ways that it's been done is to look at trauma. So when you're trying to look at an archaeological population and figure out what actually happened to them, you can look at their bones and see what happened to them. So, you see some osteoporosis here. This is a femur, this bone. You can see this was a break. And for those of you that aren't osteologists, this hole in the head is not supposed to be there. So someone added it up and looked, and they counted the number of traumatic injuries in Neanderthals. This is still the good science, by the way. We're still in the this was actually a published data set. And they looked at 7 different populations and decided that Neanderthals, their pattern of injury most closely resembled that of rodeo clowns. So, and here's where it goes from evidence-based science to a little less evidence-based science. They used this to interpret everything about the Neanderthals. So, they were riding on the backs of animals, waging into battle. This is actual published science. So, I noticed they used 7 or 8 populations. Most of them were just skeletal populations. So 7 just varied skeletal populations and 1 population of rodeo clowns. So it turns out that if you're a high school or a college athlete, a lot of times injury patterns get reported. So I added in all the different injury patterns that we see in high school and college athletics. Because we're not just going to look at rodeo clowns, we're going to look at all the different athletes. I used the original 8 data sets as well. And I am very proud to admit that the injury traumatic pattern that best fits with Neanderthal trauma, cheerleading. So, being the very, very serious scientist that I am, now that I have a conclusion, I'm going to find some evidence to support it. So I've come up with 3 different ways that we can support it. So first of all, Neanderthals, the bone right here, probably don't ever know about it. It's called the hyoid bone. And it is modified in Neanderthals and humans relative to all other human ancestors. And that's important. For those of you who don't want random facts about evolution, that's important because that helps us make speech. The hyoid bone and our tongues are the 2 things that allow me to be talking to you. And the Neanderthal bone is a little bit derived from what we think earlier hominins would have been, but not quite as complex and developed as what we think modern humans would have been. So might have been able to make simple speech, such as a rah-rah. That's fully something that Neanderthals would have been able to do. We also want to talk about symbolism, because that's something that's really hard to find in the fossil record, is when did cultures become able to use complex symbolism? And so the Neanderthal brain, so there are different areas of the Neanderthal brain that's similar to the human brain. And of course, we're looking at endocast, and we're looking at fossils. So we don't actually have a brain preserved. But we think that they would have been capable of simple symbolic culture. And if there's anything simpler than this symbolic culture where you're wearing your school across your chest and you're cheering in unison, I don't know what it is. But we can also look at teamwork. So we know that Neanderthals in certain times lived in really, really close proximity to one another. And there must have been some really complicated intergroup dynamics. And so in one way, you could have a lot of conflict. But Neanderthal group sizes were pretty small. And if you're getting into conflict with other groups and killing half of the group, that's really bad strategy. You're going to go extinct pretty quickly. So if you cheered, and you instead had shear-offs, where there was very low risk of injury, then that makes a lot more sense. It also would have increased in-group cohesion to make large-scale things like hunting, like division of labor, much more possible. So I hope that I have convinced you that the next time you hear someone talking about a Neanderthal, that you will think, oh, yeah, those ancient cheerleaders. So, that was a fun diversion, but let's get serious. So, even within evidence-based science, there are two ways of doing science. There's taking the evidence and using that to draw a conclusion, and then they're starting with the conclusion that you want and finding evidence to support it. And it is really easy to do the latter, but it leads to some really bad things. Now, one of the things that exists, and there is a lot of gray area science in the world. There's good science and there's fraud, but there's a lot of things in between. And every time you see someone dropping out individuals from their study because, well, maybe they're outliers and maybe they don't fit, we'll just remove them because it makes the p-score better. Every time you see people doing multiple tests and not reporting them, every time you see people over-interpreting the data, you're kind of moving into this gray area science. And there are real implications of this kind of bad science. There are many groups of people in this world whose oppression has been justified with crappy science. And it is a huge problem, and it persists even today. But beyond that, and I say beyond that because that is a huge problem that is beyond the scope of a single talk, it also allows people who have agendas to paint everything other than good science as complete fraud. It also allows them to take advantage of people's growing cynicism towards science to convince them of all sorts of types of misinformation. And this is what we are dealing with today. So there are a lot of misinformation strategies. If you are a science teacher and you teach middle school or high school biology, the Heartland Institute has probably tried to send you a book about how many scientists don't agree with climate change. And they sent you that book with the hope that the way that you teach climate change will change. So they generate controversy. They also seed doubt with logical fallacies. We're going to dissect some political arguments about climate change in a while, and I'll show you some logical fallacies at play. And they also wedge in alternative facts. So a lot of this, though, just like what I showed you with the Neanderthals, is taking evidence and misusing it. So it's not completely made up. It is actual science being misused for sinister purposes. If you want to learn more, these are some of the important books that I would recommend that you read. This is the propaganda. But this is an amazing book called Merchants of Doubt that talks about how the same strategies that were used for years to keep people smoking and to hide the dangers of smoking have now been being used, are now being used for climate change. I'm sorry? So the strategies that were used to keep people smoking are now used to keep people from passing legislation for climate change. If you don't want to read the book, there's also a great documentary. It came out in, I think, 2015. Definitely worth checking out. So why does this happen? Well, I do a lot of outreach, and I train a lot of people for outreach. And whenever I have a difficult conversation with someone, whenever someone wants to come up and argue with me about a fact, a lot of times they're like, well, I read this article and it was about this thing, and I'm just like, I have no idea what you're talking about, and I don't know how much you're remembering. We forget most of what we learn, and let's be real. I mean, I feel like there's so much I don't know. And there's so much I don't know even about evolution and climate change, and that's what I have a Ph.D. in and what I study. So there's so much, and many, many people just never learned it in the first place. And a little bit of knowledge, a little tiny bit of knowledge, is something that's very easily exploited. Also, if you were to stretch out all of human history, all of Earth history, 1 billion years back, we're going to start with the prokaryotic things. We're not going to go back any further. The Pleistocene, if you stretch it across a football field, Pleistocene would take up about 1 millimeter. And that's all of Homo erectus own. People cannot fathom how deep time is. People cannot fathom. It's just something that people just don't understand. And people don't understand probability. Ask anyone who runs a casino. Their livelihood is dependent on people not understanding probability. The other thing, and this is the thing that really deeply troubles me as a scientist, is that we are scared of being taken advantage of because there have been unscrupulous scientists acting to make profits. And because those people have been in existence, it makes it harder, and people learn not to trust science, not to trust experts. And also, because of this identity, people really want to align with their group. They want to fit in. The Neanderthals wanted to do it. We want to do it. And the people that really want to, a lot of times, when the average person is against climate change or against evolution, deep, deep inside them is not a desire to be right, it's a desire to fit in with their group. And I'm sure that this comes to the surprise of no one, but the internet has made it worse. So this is what science was like before internet, where you were actually reporting the headlines. And this is what science is after internet, where it turns it into clickbait titles. But social media algorithms, Facebook knows you. If you log on to Facebook and know where to look, you can find out what Facebook thinks your political views are. They're probably right. And they will specifically target content to you that you're going to like, which means that you don't get exposed to what other people see, and you don't get exposed to the other side. Now, if you believe in evidence-based science, you're going to get exposed to a lot of pretty sound reasoning. But if you are down an anti-vax rabbit hole, if you're down an anti-climate change rabbit hole, you are going to be exposed to things that just tell you what you believe and what you want to hear. And several social media sites are aware of this, and they're working to change it. But it is hard because their algorithms are designed to give us what we want to hear, and we don't want to hear the other side. So At NCSE, we specifically focus on climate change and evolution because those are things that are being taught in public schools. And so anti-vax is not really being taught in public schools yet, we hope. And so these are the things that we're really working to address. And you can see there's a huge list. We've narrowed it down to 5, but these 5 can be very unpacked into lots of other things. So I'm going to talk about climate change a lot later in the talk, so I'm going to go over a few of the really common evolution misconceptions. And these are things that it's not just kids that have these misconceptions. It's a lot of adults that really have these misconceptions. So this. How many of you have seen human evolution portrayed this way? It's even worse sometimes when it goes from someone with dark skin here to someone with light skin here. Because then not only are you factually wrong, but you're also racist on top of it. But there's a lot of problem with intentionality. So everybody thinks that evolution is directed, that we're progressing, that it's moving toward, better and better. So you have people, and this happens to me, who come up to me and are like, well, what superhuman abilities are humans going to evolve in the next 200 years? And I'm just like, oh, okay. We'll start with something simple, and we'll move to that question. But this is a really common problem because that is how evolution is framed in a lot of pop science, a lot of newspapers, is that this animal had a problem, so it evolved to fix the problem. When really that's not at all how evolution works. They're generating mutations by random chance, and those that were more successful and able to produce more offspring survived. Also, essentialism. Plato's a great guy, but the Platonic nature of things has really stuck around in Western thought for a real long time. And it turns out that if you suggest to someone that it's really hard to even define a species. I teach college kids, and when I tell them there's really no such thing as a species, they don't like that. They fight with me. And I'm like, well, how do you define one? We have this kind of back and forth conversation. And they just don't really accept. There's no such thing as a species. And it's really hard to think of species changing over time, of species evolving, of there being radiations. So, if you pick up a children's book, there's a giraffe, and then there's a zebra, and then there's an elephant. They're not different types of giraffes or elephants or zebras. Maybe there should be. Maybe we should redo children's books. But it's really hard to move past this essentialist idea of what species should be. And that's one of the major problems that keep you from understanding evolution. Also, stupid rhetoric. It's only a theory. And that is, despite this was being said 50 years ago, it will probably be being said 150 years ago. There is a willful misunderstanding of what a theory is in science. But this rhetoric, don't believe in evolution, it's just a theory. That rhetoric has permeated the scientific understanding. I have students that have been educated in good schools that come to college and have been told that. And so helping people understand what we mean by theory when we say that in a scientific context it's such a silly and simple thing, but it is essential to really getting us to understand evolution. So here are the slides that are meant to scare you. Because there's a lot at stake here. When we asked, and NCSE is currently doing another survey, but it won't come out for another year and a half. When we asked whether or not people accept evolution, the US is down here. So we did a little better than Turkey. And so it's a little bit dated. It's 2005, but it really hasn't changed. And when you look, there's a growing divide between the beliefs of scientists and the beliefs of non-scientists. So this is looking at beliefs of science. This is members of AAAS, and then just normal adults. You see that, in general, there's a 90+% consensus that humans evolved, the climate changed, and GMO foods are mostly safe, whereas you definitely do not see that in US adults. The other thing is that parents don't think that science is important and part of their children's education. I grew up in Western North Carolina. I went to a small school, and when our benchmark testing in math or reading was bad, they cut science and social studies so we could do better on the test. It's not just my school. Science education is being undervalued compared to math and English. And not to say that those aren't important, but science and history definitely round out a good, well-rounded education. Here's another very worrying thing. So people asked how competent they think people are and how warm they think people are, and kind of graphed them here. So scientists, they did pretty well on the competence. They were asked to rate out of 5. But for warmth, they got a little more than 3. So you see, doctors and professors did pretty well. We're a little warmer than lawyers. So that's heartening. So there's a growing distrust in science. And that's a problem. Because if you don't trust science, if you're not engaged in science, then you can't access the scientific content. You think science is not for you, and you put up this barrier between yourself and scientists, and you don't think that you can think like a scientist. And, I mean, you get taken advantage of. If you go on Facebook and you hang out in an essential oils Facebook group, at least some of them, you will find all sorts of scientific misinformation floating about to get you to buy things. And if you don't feel like you can engage in science and really understand the data, then scientists will try to take advantage, or sorry, not scientists, then people will try to take advantage of you. Now, what is the solution? Now, when you talk to most people, the solution that they think should happen is, well, let's just give people access to more science and give people access to science at an earlier age. So we've tried that. Now this graph, I will explain it. I will walk you through it. It is not the world's most easy to understand graph. But, so what this is looking at, do you see political identity here? So you have extremely liberal is the black line, extremely conservative is this purple line here. Now, if when you gave people more science education, you gave them more access to science, and when you ask them about science literacy, they have higher scores, if you think that giving them more access to science will work, you would expect, regardless of your political identity, for that to go up. And it goes up if you identify as a liberal. So for every single, for climate change, for human evolution here, and for climate change, this is level of education, level of science education, and your score on a science literacy assessment. As a liberal, the more science you have access to, the higher it goes up. If you are a conservative, however, the exact opposite trend happens. So the more you know about science, the less you believe in human evolution, the less you believe in climate change. And it's really bad with your science literacy scores that actually the people who know less are actually more likely, the people who know less are more likely to believe in climate change than the people who know more. So there's something really bad going on here. So what I'm going to talk about, so NZSE has been working with this for a while, And I'm going to talk about 3 different things we're doing to try and address this. And then I'm going to talk about what all of those things have in common. And then a little bit about what you can do should you want to take on climate change and evolution education in your community. So the first thing is some of the curriculum we work to present. We're obviously really interested in reaching people in areas. We're based in the Bay Area, and the Bay Area has so much good science education. There's still a lot of inequity, but we're really not focused on the Bay Area because there are so many places across the country where there really is just no science education or no good science education. And the way that we do it is we use a 3-step process. So remember, we're trying to prevent this conservative ideology from taking hold and moving people to more disbelief about evolution and climate change. So we take this three-part method. We start with the fact. So we present the fact about climate change. And then we teach them the myth or the misconception. But we tell them, we're about to teach you the misconception. And then we have them work through and figure out the logical fallacy. So this is not a teaching technique that I came up with. This is John Cook's. And he is really good, and I am just kind of really impressed with him, at his ability to help people understand what are the logical fallacies being used. So his acronym is FLIC. Fake experts, logical fallacies, impossible expectations, cherry picking, and conspiracy theories. So I figured we'll try this out for ourselves. So the fact is based on independent lines of evidence. A scientific consensus is formed that humans are responsible for global warming. And then we say, here's the myth we're going to present. 31,000 dissenting scientists prove there's no scientific consistent evidence on human-caused global warming. So that's the myth. But we don't present the myth first. We present the myth once the fact is in their brain, once it's lodged in their brain. Because if you talk about both of them at the same breath, people will walk away. Remember, people don't really have a good grasp of what they actually learned, and they'll walk away thinking, either there's no consensus or not really sure which one is true. And then you go the next step by having them identify the fallacy. So the fallacy is people who convey the impression of expertise, but with no relevant experience, are often used to cast doubt on expert consensus. So a lot of the times when you see people who don't believe in climate change, who are scientists, when you figure out what they're actually scientists in, it has nothing to do with earth science or geology. It's like, my Ph.D. is in comparative literature. So let's try it with Marco Rubio's quote. Read this. I'll know you're all done reading when you've all taken a face palm position. So, and this is something that we work on. We break down his argument. So this is logical reasoning 101. The climate has changed through natural processes. The climate is currently changing. So those are 2 premises that he introduces. Good thus far. But then he comes to this conclusion: the climate is currently changing through natural processes. Well, no, there's something missing here in the argument. So the first logical misconception we would identify is jumping to conclusions. And when you walk through these with high school kids, they're actually really good at identifying these things. Yeah?
Isn't it the percentage that it's controversial? How much is human?
So some people don't believe the climate is changing at all, but a lot of people will believe that it's not human, believe that the climate is always changing, so it's not human caused. Yeah. So that it's just the climate changing because the climate has always changed. So this is jumping to conclusions. And you see that there's this hidden premise, which is only natural processes cause climate change, which is this single cause fallacy here. So kids are starting to learn how to reason. They love to try these same strategies with picking apart their parents' arguments, if we're honest. But if you walk them through not just the facts, the myths, but also the reasoning, walk them through the reasoning, then you're more likely to get good results. And we have done this. This is all pilot data that I'm presenting. You can see that even though relative to traditional learning misconceptions, they still score pretty badly on the pretest, that they do much better on the post-test, and even when you wait a little bit, they're still doing a lot better. So that is what we're doing in K through 12 schools. But we also have an outreach campaign. And I don't know how many of you have ever been involved in outreach, but a lot of science outreach is very bad. And so a lot of science outreach is experts lecturing at the populace about why they're wrong. And this, unfortunately, has the opposite event. So we work in really small places that really do not have access to science. So we actually do these comparison studies where we ask people in the community, and then we ask people at the university. And so the same community surrounding a university to really make sure that we're reaching really a group that is underserved by science. And you can see, these are small, but we ask, have you talked to a scientist about a topic other than science? So do you know anything? Do you actually know a scientist is really what we're getting at. But it's hard to ask that question. So we ask, have you talked to a scientist about a topic other than science? Have you talked to a scientist in a grocery store about recipes? Have you talked to a scientist about whether or not they're picking your kids or you're picking their kids up from school? And what we find in the university, most people have. But in the community, most people haven't. So this is really the target group that we're trying to reach. What's really interesting in our work is that it really doesn't depend on where you go in high school. So we ask people, and we ask people what kind of high school you went to. We asked them several other questions, but this is some of my favorite data. And it doesn't seem to be driven based on high school. So even people that go to the greatest high schools in the state are not really being engaged with science as adults. There's really no difference between the university-going community and the community that did not attend university. Though there is some right in the back here. So how do you do outreach that's actually going to impact people? And this is really hard. It's especially really hard for scientists. What I do now, a lot of what I do now, is I actually work with scientists about how to talk to people. Because it's a really hard thing to do. And so I run a graduate fellowship program where graduate students come and they work with us to figure out how to do effective outreach in their communities. Applications will open in September. If you have any friends that would be interested, it's really fun. We pay you. It's great. But we make sure that every single time we're out in the community, we're doing something that's inquiry-based. So you have something that you can touch. You have data. We're not just telling you stuff. You're figuring it out for yourself. We make sure that it's flexible. We build modules if you are low-sighted, if you are hard of hearing, if you don't speak the language that our interpreters are speaking. We have modifications so that you are included in our activities. And we work with this thing called the no conflict approach. And the no conflict approach is a really effective way of actually reaching people and actually changing their minds. I will tell you about it once I go through all of these things, because it's something that I would love for you guys to have some chance to practice with. And so, unfortunately, my videos are not going to work on this computer, and I do not want to accidentally crash the entire thing. But we try and train people in a guest-centric or a visitor-centric way of interacting with people. So rather than you, this interpreter, being there imparting knowledge, you're just kind of there to facilitate, to hang out, to explore along with the visitor. So instead of people getting turned off because the science is, because it's really scary, or this is just like school, or I may not be able to do this, or this person is going to ask me a question that I'm not going to know the answer to, and then I'm going to feel bad, we instead allow them to explore along with us. So we don't do anti-vax, but we did have a flu shot activity. It's all about the evolution of the flu shot. But we do have conversations about anti-vax, should that come up. But we allow young kids to build the components of the flu shot. And then they spend a lot of time, well, this girl is administering it to herself. This girl is administering it to the brain of her pet dinosaur. But for older kids, we actually set up a role-playing epidemiological mystery. So they get briefed, and then they travel to 5 different countries, and they talk to people about the different strains of flu that are happening. They read infographics. It's basically like a video game where they learn about what's happening. They learn about whether or not it's bird flu or regular flu, but they have to kind of figure it out through the interviews and through the conversations with people. And then they do some lab experiments where they're actually testing, where they're actually building antigenic assays. They're building the flu shot, and then they're trying to administer it as quickly as possible to stop this outbreak from happening. So they actually get to role play all the different parts of an epidemiological case, but they're actually doing the science. We obviously have it set up so we kind of know what the science outcomes will be, but they are not just repeating the science, they are actually going through and making that scientific inquiry for themselves. And the volunteers that are supporting this, they are there to kind of answer questions or give some hints if that needs to happen, but we let the kids take the lead. And this is something that's really effective because we let them feel like they can be scientists. Like there isn't this giant barrier between scientists and non-scientists. We let them do the process of science so they can feel like they are scientists. We also do a lot with engineering design challenges because one of the best ways to get people involved in finding solutions to climate change is to tell them that they can come up with solutions for climate change. And if you get them solving a puzzle, so this is to combat sea level rise, if you get them solving a puzzle and you get them building something and then you let them have success. So this group's house is going to stand. This group, there's a house behind that sponge. Not sure how well this tested, but this group came up with a solution. If you let them have success, once they've had success, they feel like, oh, I can change the course of climate change. I can help find solutions. And once you give them that success, it opens them up to believing that they can be part of the solution. Which is something that if you're working in rural areas like we are, is really important. I will not say much more about this, but this is another kind of role-playing activity about the evolution of bioluminescence. And then finally, I want to talk a little bit, this is before my work with NCSE, but I've been really interested in how do we raise the next generation of people to think like scientists. So I've taught a class 3 times now called Prove It with Science, which is all about this gray area science. And all about training people who want to become scientists, but who also are not really sure, maybe they just want to go and maybe they want to be, something else, but they want to be able to understand what's the difference between good science and bad. So, research methods is the most boring thing that you could ever teach. It's really hard and boring, and it's just a lot of memorization. So what we do is we actually start and have them create the bad science. So the first day, they have to design a survey that will give flawed results. And in the process of designing a survey that gives flawed results, they're able to realize how many of the surveys that they've been taking gave them flawed results. We also ask them to do some p-hacking. So p-hacking, I don't know if you don't know a p-value, that's a probability value that what the science that you're presenting wasn't caused by chance. And there are quite a lot of people who find p-values right at the acceptable value of 0.05. So it's been shown over and over and over again, which means that people are able to kind of manipulate the data to create p-values. So sometimes, let's say you measure 40 different things. I work in biological anthropology, so let's say you take 40 different measurements on a bone. And then you see which ones correlate with one another. Now, if you're taking 40 measurements and you find 2 that correlate really well with one another, and you don't report all the rest of them, I mean, you found something. But you're not exactly finding something that is probably scientifically significant. But if you write your methods to not talk about that, you don't mention all the other 38 measurements, you just are like, oh, these were the 2 that I cared about, and look, I found data. Then it's really hard to identify. So we actually train people to do the bad science. So we actually pull 2 things out of a hat. I pull 2 words out of a hat, and they have to do a project that says X causes Y. And they give a TED talk. So really big ideas presented really well. We do a lot of like this motion and this motion because we're serious scientists. But we don't actually do, then they kind of dissect it. And what we found is that they're able to recognize a lot of the bad science that happens by virtue of doing the bad science themselves. So those are 3 very different methods of going about having good interventions to science education. But there's some overarching conclusions. You always need to cover both the fact and the fiction. You have to cover the fact first, but you don't want to fail to cover the fiction, but you want to be able to identify it as such. You also need to give students a chance to work with the data. Now, in our underfunded schools, that can be really, really hard. But students that work with the data are able to draw conclusions for themselves, so they're less likely to think that the misinformation that they're being given, which is normally not based on data that they've gotten a chance to work with, is the same. They're less likely to make the false equivalencies between my teacher tells me one thing and the internet tells me another thing, because it's not their teacher telling them, it's them telling themselves. And the third thing is that you need to specifically address the fiction and specifically help them understand why it is a fiction. So it's not enough to say, this is a fiction. You have to take the next step and help them gain their logic skills to dissect it. So this is potentially the most controversial part of my talk. So, and that is, how do you talk to these people? So, I want everybody, so I'm going to assume that overall this is a pretty science-friendly crowd. And I want everybody to think back to some of their earliest memories about science. What made you feel included in the scientific community? You can just take 30 minutes to think about all those childhood experiences or maybe early adult experiences that turned you on to science. So I'm going to guess, for most of you, that it was something like a teacher, a parent that was really passionate about science, a parent that brought you to a science museum. You thought dinosaurs were really cool. You saw the space shuttle launching into space and were like, oh, that's really awesome. I'm going to guess that most of you were not turned on to science because you're like, I really thought the confluence of scientific evidence leading to a conclusion was really fascinating. I really thought that, this statistical method, it intrigued me. I'm guessing that is not what your 5-year-old self thought about science. Maybe. I would love to be wrong if somebody got really into statistics as a 5-year-old. More power to you. But in general, which means that it isn't science itself. The thing that led you to become a scientist was something that was really fascinating in science. It was an emotional response. It was a social response, more so than it was an excitement about the evidence. And that's okay. But you also have to acknowledge that the people who have gotten really turned off to science, the people who are so upset about science that they are actively working to take it out of science standards, who are actively working to, prevent science-based evidence to be used to influence politics. Some of that, they also had an emotional and a social response. It was just the opposite. And in my framework, I use 3 different categories of science. There's science naive, and the science naive can be people who are either never engaged with science or never wanted to engage with science. And they're skeptics, and I hope that's where many of you are, who maintain a healthy skepticism about certain science, but are mostly happy about science itself. And then there are the cynics. And these are the people that have had so many bad experiences with science, who've been really engaged with it, but who've had so many bad experiences with it that they are turned off. And this is another, the internet slide. But, the internet. So we live in echo chambers, and we live with places where cynics and science naive mostly fight with each other, and the skeptics are left there thinking, I don't want to engage. Whereas in real life, most of the time, most people fall somewhere on the skeptical spectrum. But the thing that I want you to be really, that you can accept or not, but I want you to think about, is that the underlying values and the underlying doubt and the fear that lead people to be turned off and science naive is also what the same values, to a certain extent, that lead people to become science cynics. There is some shared distrust of experts, some shared belief that science is out to get you or science is in it for a profit. Big pharma is out to get you. There's a lot of similarity between these 2 groups. That people who are science naive, now there's certainly differences, but there's some underlying shared values. And therefore, because they're underlying shared values, because we're all humans, because despite the fact that we all want to be driven by evidence, we are driven by our social values, we're driven by our personal experience, we're driven by our group dynamics, that there's a way to talk to people who disagree with you in a way that will actually enact change. And we call this the no conflict approach. And this is like my old school, acronym style, but it's a lot more nuanced than that. So if you are talking to someone who wants to fight with you, who wants to debate with you, who comes up to whatever you're doing and who is telling you, well, this is worthless, I don't believe in this, you're terrible. I've had this happen more times than I would like to recount. There are ways of getting them to maybe not change their mind on the spot, but to really slowly reevaluate what's happening. And so one of the ways you can do it is that you can identify the scientific reasoning that they're using. You can help them understand that they're being a scientist. So when they present evidence, you can identify it as such. When they make a hypothesis, you can identify this as such. And you can actually, oh, that's great. You saw this paper which said this, so you're making this conclusion. You can reward them for the scientific thinking that they're doing. Because even if they hate science, they're probably still using science methods to express how they hate science. Just saying. The other thing is avoiding debate. I know this is really hard because we all like to debate. But you can actually win by losing a debate. If you can de-escalate the situation, if you can find shared values with this person, maybe you don't want to talk about the science, but maybe you identify yourself as a member of the community. And maybe they're also a member of the community. And maybe you also are really worried about making sure that the next generation has access to good science education. There are people who really don't like to talk about climate change, who really, really want their grandkids to be able to go to a school that is rigorous. And maybe that's your shared value. And yes, they're working against it, but you don't have to put that out to them. You can let them get there themselves. You can bond over that shared value and make that personal connection and go from there. The other thing is maintaining a friendly tone, and that doesn't mean just not shouting with them, but that means learning together, doing horizontal learning, doing horizontal sharing, letting them teach you as you teach them. And then empathize. We do something related to radical empathy. And I'm going to walk you through some of the training we do. We call it the no conflict approach, pretty similar to radical empathy. So this is a real situation that happened to me when I was doing interpretation in a museum in Western North Carolina. I was doing an evolution activity, and I had two girls wearing youth group shirts come up to me, like they were coming up to everyone else who was doing an evolution activity, and start to debate evolution with me. This is it's happened to me multiple times. This is the first time it happened, and I didn't handle it very well, so it stuck with me. I was 16 at the time, and I had no idea what I was doing. So in a traditional framework, when this happens, it's really easy to think, why do they come here? Well, they're here to debate evolution. And they want to debate evolution, and that's why they approached me. And they want me to admit that I'm wrong, or to convert, or they want to humiliate me. They value religion, they fear science, and I can either engage and win, engage and lose, or not engage. And that was what was going through my mind as people who were really my age at the time were coming up and trying to humiliate me. And I've had a while to think about it. I've had a lot more experience, and I've worked a lot in radical empathy. So if I could go back and talk to my 16-year-old self and smack some sense into her, here's what I'd do. So why did they come here? Because they wanted to hang out with their youth group, and it's fun to be with their friends. Why did they approach me? Well, they want to fit in, and that's what their friends are doing. But also, at some degree, The skeptic in me wonders how much, but to some degree, they really do want to make the world a better place. And they really think that what they're doing is helping to make the world a better place. The outcome that they want is that they want to be right, but really, this is challenging for them, and they want success, which is the same for me. And if I'm being honest with my 16-year-old self, I was there talking to people because I was a shy little girl, and this was a real big challenge for me, and that was why I wanted to be there in the first place, talking to people about science. And that we also have some shared values, because I'm spending my weekend talking about science with people. They're spending their weekend, instead of going to the movies, they're spending their weekend doing religion. And we're both willing to stand out from the crowd, which is hard in high school. And that's a very courageous thing to do. And what they fear, and this is the part that I really did not understand, that they were as terrified to be there as I was. That they were as terrified that I would attack them as I was that they would attack me. And they were really worried about being shunned from their community. So if I had any social intelligence back in the day, I would have probably tried to leverage those shared values that we have. I would have tried to compliment them on how courageous they were being, on the fact that they really were doing something that wasn't what a typical teenager would be doing. I would acknowledge their fear that they were going to be yelled at, that they were going to be attacked. And I would have refocused them. Instead of doing the debate, I would have helped them focus on the evidence. Because even if they were not going to change their mind about evolution that day, they were going to have a positive experience with the scientists, a positive experience with science. And they were going to be able to see the data for themselves. And, let's be real, did not happen. I was terrified and froze and tried to just get them to go away as quickly as possible. But it's not working. Should I mute it? Battery's low. All right, let me take this off. So this is the framework that I think is really, really important to use. It's not the framework that's going to help you win debates. It's not the framework that is going to always help you feel the best about yourself and feel like you've won. But if we are trying to change minds, if we are trying to change the way that people feel and the way that they think about science, this is a really good way to do it. We've been doing this technique in really rural communities, and it really is effective. We are able to go in super evangelical communities and do evolution activities, and we don't have much pushback because we do it in a respectful way that lets people acknowledge their boundaries. And yes, they don't walk away believing in evolution every single time, but they walk away knowing that they can talk to a scientist about science, and they're going to feel respected, they're going to feel valued, and they're going to feel like they can come back. And it's going to be a slow process. It always is to change people's minds, but it will happen over time. And so, if you will permit me, I'd like to walk us through a few other experiences that I or people at NCSE have had, and think about taking a radical empathy approach. Because I know many of you are working in the communities, and I know many of you would like to be able to spread science. So this is a really common one, where we have a mom come up with a child, and the mom is not really sure about evolution, but the child really wants to play with things, because a lot of times we have bones. It's fun to touch them. So It's apparently one about climate change, but we'll do it with climate change, sure. And so the kid will start doing the activity, and the mom is like, who are you people? Are you trying to indoctrinate my child? Like, I don't know about this. And, you know, it's really easy to get angry at the mom. It's really easy to think, oh my gosh, just let them do this. But when you think about it, the mom is afraid of a lot of things. She's afraid of her daughter being indoctrinated, but she's also probably afraid that her daughter is going to learn things that she doesn't know. And she's afraid of looking silly or stupid in front of her child. Fear and guilt are really strong drivers of a lot of the negative reactions that you see. So, but she probably let her daughter come up to some degree because she really wanted her daughter to have an education. So if you can leverage the shared values, education of children is important, but present it in a way that doesn't make her address those fears, that doesn't make her look stupid, then it's really a lot easier for her to have a positive experience. And then I'm gonna walk you through one other, and this is the kind of neutral side. This is what we get a lot. Or when you talk about climate change, you have people who are like, well, I really think we need to listen to both sides of the debate. I'm young, and you know, a lot of times I get lectured by older people. You know, I think that there's always two sides to every story, and they're equally valid, and when you get my age, you will understand. Which is, sure. But when you think about why are they believing this? Well, they have a distrust in science, and they have been living through this political discourse of science evidence being misconstrued. They don't want to be wrong. And it's actually pretty easy to deal with them because you really just make them do the activity. And you kind of make them do the activity in a way where you're like, oh, well, if you were a kid, next we would do this. And you kind of do an activity in the meta sense. But if you can help them focus on the activity and actually take the evidence for themselves, then they're much more likely to think that they've done it. So I'm going to stop there because I think I've been talking for about an hour. If you're interested in learning more about what we do, check out ncse.com. If you are interested in science outreach, if that is something you're like, oh, I really want to try this out, we have a science outreach program. It is free. We send you activity kits. We train you. It's super fun. The summer activity is going to be time traveling back to the Permian-Triassic extinction. We have a time machine that we're going to mail out, and you're going to be kind of playing Pokemon and going around and capturing all the other animals that have escaped and bring them back for the Permian-Triassic extinction. So definitely check it out. We train you in content, we train you in interpretation style, and we help you find events in the community. So if you're interested in learning more, check us out. Thank you very much, guys.
If you have questions, come up to the mic, please, so we can record it, and we'll have it both sides of it, okay? So please come up, either side.
Hey, how's it going? So, first of all, thank you for coming. So I guess it's not super related or sort of related to your talk, but something that has been bugging me for a while. Why do we only make publications that work? What I mean by that is, you as a scientist, you publish when you actually discover something, but why we don't actually publish our hypotheses that they didn't become theories? Because I think if we publish it, what went wrong, then the bad science people kind of use that, calling it good science.
Yes. So I think you're absolutely right. And there are a few journals out there. There's a journal of negative research or negative results. I think that's right. And there also are a lot of, when you do meta-analysis,
Okay.
you can assess just how much missing data there is, which are those research papers that didn't come up. But it's a huge problem where you aren't publishing everything. And it's, a structural problem with academia where you want to publish the highest impact papers and have a wonderful story, and most research results in, it kind of looks like this, but maybe not. And so hopefully, ultimately, the culture of science will change to allow a more honest telling of the actual facts. But yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah.
There's a gentleman who used to come to this group. I don't think he's here today. I don't think he's been here for a while. And he was politically conservative, but he was in the military and he was an expert. And some of you may know who I'm talking about when I describe that he's, I believe, given talks to this very group about debunking UFO sightings and things like that. But as a political conservative, I was surprised, whatever number of years ago I last spoke with him, to learn that he did not believe in climate change as a political conservative. And he had, I forget exactly what his field of expertise is, but it wasn't climatology, but it was something to do with engineering or science. But as a conservative, he told me, well, what's the biggest greenhouse gas in the atmosphere? And I shrugged my shoulders, and he said, water vapor. Water vapor is 90% of greenhouse gas. So, and he made this, and I was not in a position to debate with him. I guess my point is that depending on who you're talking to, and shifting to anti-vaxxers for a minute, I go back and forth with pro and anti-vaxxers on Facebook. Born in 1956, I never had the measles vaccine because even by CDC guidelines, anyone born before 1957 is presumed to be immune because everyone had the measles and we all survived. So when I make that point, some people accuse me of being anti-vax, and I'm saying no. I'm just saying that most people who get measles will survive it. But I will say to the anti-vaxxers, I think even if it just saves a few lives, it's worth vaccinating your kids. And they'll accuse me of ignoring the medical people, the MDs who they can find on the internet, who will give all kinds of data showing the vaccine is ineffective or causes more harm than good in their estimation. So how do we, it seems like we should try and get more, besides a respectful debate, there has to be, I think, more nuance in our arguments. I mean, that we say vaccines are safe, but I mean, there are occasional, just like there are people few and far between, but who do have peanut allergies, but some few kids may have an allergic reaction. Some may even have a seizure that may or may not be related to a fever spike after a vaccine. It doesn't mean, that it's not worth vaccinating your kids, but to be honest, not to pounce on people, like you say, who may have some concerns or questions. I mean, Bill Maher has said this about vaccine, and he's accused of being anti-vax, but I don't think, he's certainly, a rational person overall and an outright atheist. So just a comment on that issue.
Yeah. No, it's, so we did the flu shot activity, which is all about the evolution of the flu and not about anti-vax. Wink, wink. But when we make sure that every single thing, so some people have allergic reactions to the egg that's in flu vaccines. Some people, we do make sure that when we build the flu shot that we put in preservatives. Now, some of them there are flu vaccines, for example, that still have thimerosal in them. Those are multi-use vials that will be used over and over and over again. And so it's a very, very small proportion, but we make sure that we convey the information accurately, because it's more important for us, for someone who is vaccine hesitant or someone who is anti-vax, to show that we are being honest and acknowledging, just like what you were saying, than for us to really change their minds. Though we have had a lot of conversations where we are allowing people to ask us those questions. So yes, there are a lot of crazy doctors on the internet who say a lot of things, and especially when you're listening to someone recount the crazy doctor on the internet and try and remember what they said, it gets a little fuzzy. But overall, it's been an effective strategy.
Two things. This can take on political overtones. So I think a lot of people regard science as sort of a liberal thing, and therefore it's not to be trusted if they're not in that camp. Is that right?
Yes, it is, but why it's gotten there is a confusing and puzzling issue, because it shouldn't be. But yes, that is true.
And the other thing is, when you hear about the faith community, people understand that faith is emotional and it's powerful. And so it has this component of being powerful. Therefore, it's more persuasive than science, which is not necessarily emotional.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So making science be exciting and engaging while still having the meat of the science is something that is really important. I will say with climate change, though, in recent years, the faith-based communities have actually really started, many faith-based communities have really started taking action. And so they've seen that the service that they do, that they would normally like to do in their communities, can be done in fighting against climate change. So I think that's one positive thing that's come out of the faith-based communities with climate change education.
You talk about going mostly to rural communities. How do you find venues, and do people come to you, or do you go to schools or to churches, and what kind of venues do you seek to target?
That's a really good question, and I should have answered that in my talk, so thank you so much for asking it. So we try to go to venues that are free and publicly accessible. So a lot of science museums these days, it's like $20, $25 to get admission. So if you're a family of four, $100 to spend for a weekend outing, that just may not be possible. But we want to increase equity and access to science education. So we do a lot of work at public libraries. In the summers, we work in farmers markets. We are at the state fair, we're at county fairs. We go to harvest festivals. I guess in my work recently in the Bay Area, I've worked at schools, libraries, Audubon societies, botanical gardens, worked at Berkeley's Harvest Festival. So anywhere where people might not expect to see science education. So you're not just reaching the people that are self-selecting to be there, but the people who might get extra access, who might not otherwise be able to do it.
Hi. I did notice in one of those charts that Ireland was at the top of that chart. And the
Iceland.
It was Iceland? Oh, good. Okay. That was a point, too. Some of the print was a little small.
Yes, I'm sorry about that.
Yeah. But those other charts that you showed that people who were, more, conservative or whatever, that give them more information and they go to less, is that people, are those programs using other methods than what you guys used?
In general, yes.
Okay, that's good.
Yes. So those are just traditional. That's all we're not asking, this was before we really started dealing with before we really started redesigning curriculum. So that was any type of science education. So it was asking them what is the highest degree they have, asking them how many science courses they've taken, and then giving them a 10-question assessment to assess their science literacy. So it was those three things. So we think that these things, based on our data, are helping even address that among conservatives. But this data predates the interventions we've made. I don't know who's next.
Thank you. There are times that I think that science has failed us relative to a broad public relations initiative. Because when anyone says that they struggle with or don't accept science or believe scientists, they probably are talking to their friends on an iPhone. One of the most complex devices devised by scientists. They drove there, many of them probably in a hybrid, an incredibly complex car. Medicine, when they get sick, they rush to the best specialists they can get, and yet they have the confidence to say they don't believe in science. How do you explain that?
Have you heard a scientist give a lecture?
Yes, but I use this. This is scientific. That's why I worry about the public relations issue.
I think you're absolutely right. I think that the things that make you a good scientist, which is being exact, which is explaining all the nuance, which is making sure that no one can get the got ya moment. Because if you go to grad school and you're given a talk, every time you show up a slide and you don't say, oh, and like we accounted for body size and we did blind sampling, someone is going to raise their hand and be like, but did you consider this? So that's the way that we're trained to talk about science. And then you get out in the public face and no one is trying to play gotcha, or most people aren't. They're just trying to communicate and understand. Then you kind of have not a great communication strategy there. So I think that training scientists to be better communicators and be better PR for the. I mean, I think that's really, when you think about how science is going to change, that's one of the ways that it really needs to change.
If I could make one other
Yes.
ask one other question. I used to sell medical device products into a university hospital. And I was well aware that the state, people in the state would flock to that hospital for their difficult issues. So they believed in medical science. But I also knew that there was a Bible scholar, a Bible historian, also teaching at the school that was every bit the scientist as those cancer specialists. And the conservative community rejected him out of hand. And I worry that that's an ethical issue, that when you accept the science from a particular area, but reject the science from a different area because of it violates your preconceived notions, I worry about the ethics that we have accepted.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Well, I mean, when you look at who is the most trusted, it's not doctors, it's nurses. So nurses are one of the most trusted people. And so that's why if you watch a lot of political campaigns and you see who's endorsing people, it's the nurses and the firefighters, because those are the people that have a high level of community trust. And when you think about why nurses who have a major degree of scientific knowledge, but they're so much more trusted than doctors who presumably have the same degree of scientific knowledge, why are nurses more trusted? And no one has really done a great job of studying this, but I hypothesize that it's a combination of them having better people skills and them spending more time with the patients and getting to know them and treating them like people. And so I think eventually there's going to have to be a reckoning with the science culture at large, because I think we're doing a really, overall, a pretty poor job of communicating with the public.
Thank you. You mentioned in your outreach program that you
teach the kids the conflict and then go through the fallacies. Where are we in teaching critical thinking and the common fallacies in the general public education? What kind of standards do we have, and how well have they penetrated through the states?
Well, it's very much a state-by-state thing, and really because it isn't content and it's rarely tested, it's mostly a teacher-by-teacher thing. So some teachers do whole units on logic, and in Massachusetts, where I worked a lot with public schools, I would actually come in and we'd do some of this work with 8th graders as part of their social studies curriculum. And it would really be identifying logical fallacies, and they'd apply it to climate change arguments, but then they'd apply it to political arguments. But that isn't something that happens everywhere. And I think in teaching people lots of content, there's so much variation in public schools, and there are certainly schools that do a great job, but I think that teaching people how to think and teaching people how to understand what the data is something that we really need to work on. I'm done, so I'm just going to close the PC before it gets angry with me. All right. Yes?
All right. My husband and I are both retired nurses. So. We appreciate that. But I was wondering, we're noticing that there are more and more and more nurse practitioners that people are seeing, and whether that is changing or going to change the statistics or not between nurses and doctors.
I have not seen them on I have not seen statistics on nurse practitioners. So I don't know, but that would be a really good thing. Do nurse practitioners, they engage more with the patients, right?
They do.
Yeah, so hopefully there'll be this kind of vessel of communicating knowledge and being a triage. So that would be
Right.
good.
But nobody's studied that yet.
I don't think I have not seen data on it, but this was just looking at public trust across all different types of careers. So that's a good question. It would be good to see.
Okay.
Huh.
I was going to make another comment.
Of course.
This has to do with medical literature. I don't know, it was back in the 90s probably. Big effort to kind of assess cost effectiveness of doing procedures. And they were looking at a procedure, doing follow-up colonoscopies after you removed a dangerous polyp, quote unquote, dangerous polyp from somebody. When should you follow up? They had two branches. One was a 3-year follow-up, and one was a 1-year follow-up, followed by a 2-year follow-up after the 1-year follow-up. Well, the conclusion was that the result of dangerous polyps was the same in both groups, so you should just do a 3-year follow-up after removing a dangerous polyp. Dangerous polyps are defined by size or the histology. Well, when you actually read the article and looked at the data, in the group with the 3-year follow-up, there was some cancers. In the group with the 1-year follow-up, there were no cancers. There was in the 2-year follow-up after that, because they didn't do a follow-up after they took out the other polyps. But my point is, the whole reason to do a colonoscopy is to avoid getting cancer. And they're looking at the cost effectiveness, and what they did was they considered cancers to be dangerous polyps. So they didn't sub-analyze the group for cancer. And they published the article in the New England Journal, and it is part of the standards now. We do 3-year follow-ups after removing a dangerous polyp. They don't care that you may get cancer. They care about the cost. And that's our standard now. I might point out, you go to Canada where they don't do colonoscopies as a screening test, but if they find a dangerous polyp, they will do a follow-up in 1 year. So it depends on their definition. This is like your p-value shifting, what they do in order to publish a paper. And then you end up with a recommendation, which really is not the best medical care, but it's the most cost-efficient medical care. It was the goal of the study.
Yeah. So one of the things, I worked on the evolution of human wisdom teeth. That was my Ph.D. project. And I was really interested because we're one of the few countries that remove wisdom teeth prophylactically, which is basically that when you're 12, 13, 14, all the way down to college, it's like dentist comes, pulls you in, and is like, it's time to get your wisdom teeth out. But other countries don't do that. Other countries wait until they actually become impacted, infected, actually need to come out to remove them. And so I was really interested in this principal-agent conflict where dentists are telling you, okay, it's time to come out, and you believe them because what are you going to do? Tell your dentist that he's a liar? And in general, there's a lot of that going on where there is a cost element to healthcare decision making. This is opening a huge can of worms. I'll be happy to talk to you about it more at lunch because there's a lot of different elements about it. But there are some really shady actors, and there are some best practices that are definitely not the best practice. But a lot of people do work to make sure that they're taking the best care for their patients. So there are definitely bad actors out there, but they're a much smaller proportion than many people think.
Thank you, Kate. We'd like to thank you once again, everybody.